All right, beginning this week, we're going to wander back into the Old Testament, and more specifically, we're going to go into the book of Judges. And we're going to focus on some of the more important people and events that marked Israel's early years in the Promised Land. This is going to take us into the dark days that occurred during the time of the judges in Israel. We read in chapter 17, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Now, during the time of the judges, there was no central government in Israel. So everyone was sort of on the honor system to just do the right thing, and I don't have to tell you that that system did not work very well. Now, just to let you know what my plan is, if the Lord lets me live, starting sometime in December, we're going to look at King David as well as his relationship with King Saul. Then in February, we're going to be looking at David's son Solomon. Then we'll spend 10 weeks going through parts of Luke's gospel. And after that, we're going to head over to the book of Acts for another 11 weeks. And this would take us through the month of July. Now, our lesson text for today is actually chapter 4 and 5 of the book of Judges. Chapter 4 is the historical account, and chapter 5 is the poetic account of the same events. But in the interest of time, I'm going to assume that you've already read the lesson text in advance, and we're only going to be looking at some of the selected verses from those two chapters. This passage of Scripture deals with one of the more well-known judges, a woman named Deborah. Now, the book of Judges covers a period of Israel's history between 1375 and 1050 BC. This is the period of time between the death of Joshua and the rise of the last judge in Israel. It was a man named Samuel. If you'll remember, Joshua was the man that God had chosen to lead the tribes of Israel into the promised land of Canaan. And after several brilliant battles, the Israelites captured some key cities in Canaan. At that point, Joshua divided the land among the tribes, and each tribe settled into its own little patch of real estate. Now, along with the land came instant prosperity. This was promised back in the book of Deuteronomy. When the Lord your God brings you into the land that he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob to give to you, with great and good cities that you did not build, and houses full of all good things that you did not fill, and cisterns that you did not dig, and vineyards and olive trees that you did not plant. Well, that's exactly what happened. The Israelites just moved into the Canaanite cities, and the vineyards were already there. The houses and furniture were already there. They had instant prosperity. But in the same passage from Deuteronomy, Moses also offered Israel this warning. He says, "And when you eat and are full, then take care lest you forget the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery." Unfortunately, all was not rosy in paradise. The Israelites did have a foothold in the promised land, but they had decided to settle in too quickly. God had commanded them to completely destroy the Canaanites, but many portions of the promised land were still in Canaanite hands. This was especially true of the more desirable areas along the coastal plains. You see, the coastal areas were flat, and the armies of the Philistines and the Phoenicians were very strong and very well armed. Plus, the fact that the land was flat also allowed them to use their chariots with great effectiveness. So even though God had promised that they would be victorious over the Canaanites, the Israelites just weren't up to the fight. So they ended up settling in the hill country to the east. This land, as the area wasn't as good, and life was much more difficult there. This situation was complicated even farther by the fact that the hill country in Israel is divided by a very wide valley known as the Valley of Jezreel. And this valley was controlled by the Canaanites. So this situation effectively prevented the Jews from becoming a unified nation. And as a result, they ended up as basically 12 separate tribes that were loosely held together by a common history and a common tradition. Well, since there was no centralized government at that time, and they really weren't a nation, since there wasn't anything that they could be unified around. So at this point in their history, Israel was basically a group of tribes that did their own thing. In fact, the tribes weren't even organized enough to formally meet together. As a result, the nation that God had made was in real trouble. This is the first time since they left Egypt that God has left them on their own, and they aren't doing very well. Well, at that time, the real threat to Israel came from within. You see, since the people who were slaves in Egypt hadn't trusted God to keep the promise to give them the land and give them the victory over the Canaanites, God didn't allow them to enter the promised land. They had to wander through the wilderness until they were all dead. Even Moses wasn't allowed to enter. So, the people who had actually entered Canaan weren't the same people who had left Egypt. These people had never suffered the oppression of slavery, and they hadn't seen the miracles that God had performed to free their parents from that slavery. The only thing they knew about was that part of Israel's history was the stories that their fathers and grandfathers had told them. And the only things that they knew about God was what other people had told them. You see, they had never had any direct contact with God. And their lifestyle had changed dramatically when they entered Canaan. They went from being a group of nomads to being farmers and merchants. And this wasn't all new and strange to them. Well, the Canaanites were very successful farmers. If you remember when Moses sent the first spies into Canaan and they brought back a bunch of grapes that was so large that it took 2 men to carry it. Well, the Israelites wanted to know how to grow crops like that. So they began to go to the Canaanites in order to learn their farming techniques. As a result, during this time in Israel's history, obeying God's law is the only common thread that was keeping the Jews together at all. But unfortunately, as they integrated with the Canaanites, they began to forget God's law. You see, the Canaanite culture, as well as their farming techniques, were actually all an integral part of their religion. So as the Israelites began using the Canaanite methods for farming, they also became involved in the obscene fertility rites that the Canaanites practiced as a part of their religion. According to the Canaanites, you had to participate in these disgusting rituals in order to guarantee the fertility of the land. And since these rites usually involved bizarre sexual acts with temple prostitutes, the men of Israel didn't have to be dragged there kicking and screaming into the Canaanite temples. Sorry, Margaret, the peas aren't doing too well right now, so I'm going to go down to the temple and have sex with a prostitute this afternoon. We got to get the peas growing, you know. So basically, the Jews gave lip service to God, but they were mostly worshiping the Canaanite gods. Baal was the supreme fertility god in the Canaanite religion. He was the storm god who controlled the wind and the rain. And of course, you need those things to have a successful harvest. Ashtoreth, who was also known as Astarte, Ishtar, Asherah, and many other names, depending on where you happen to be, was Baal's girlfriend, and she was the goddess of fertility. Well, the Canaanites believed that when these two gods had sex, the land was supposed to be fertile and the rains were abundant. So the people would have sex in the temple with the temple prostitutes in order to try to stimulate their gods to do the same thing. There were also some groups that sacrificed children to Baal. Later, they did the same thing to the Babylonian god Marduk. Well, the Israelites were participating in these pagan practices because they thought that this would guarantee that they would enjoy bumper crops every year. They had forgotten who was really in charge of their destiny. The fact that God gave them good crops in spite of what they were doing says a lot about his love for Israel. Well, this falling away from God led to disaster, and God's judgment was very simple. He would allow some of the pagan people in the area around Israel to invade their land and take away their spoils. This created great economic hardship for the Israelites. Sometimes he would even allow their enemies to dominate parts of Israel for a time. Well, eventually the people would see the error of their ways and they would turn back to God. And when they did that, God would raise up a leader from within one of the tribes. And with God's help, this leader would lead the Israelites to drive the pagans out, and all would be well once again. Now, even though these leaders were called judges, they didn't limit their activities to simply presiding over court cases. The Hebrew word is shofat, and that word has various meanings. It did refer to judges who conducted trials, but in this case, their duties went far beyond that. The word shofat also refers to someone who avenges, condemns, contends with, punishes, executes, and governs. So these judges weren't judges in the sense of courtrooms and lawyers, even though they did attribute arbitrate disputes among the people. They were basically military leaders who were led by God to defeat Israel's enemies and release the people from their pagan control. Now, this pattern of falling away, repentance, and deliverance was repeated over and over again for many years. And during the time of our scripture passage, the people were disobedient once again, and God's judgment was upon them. God had allowed a man named Jabin, who was the king of Canaan, to overthrow the Israelites and dominate them for 20 years. Well, they finally saw the error of their ways, and they cry out to God for deliverance from Jabin's control. Now, the obvious question is, why didn't they just go off and get off their butts and defeat Jabin themselves? Why did they think God should do it for them? Well, the reason is found in the ruthless general by the name of Sisera. It seems that Sisera's army had 900 chariots, and they weren't your common garden variety wooden chariots either. They were chariots that were made of iron. So to oppose Chariot's army would be like asking a squad of foot soldiers to go up against a battalion of tanks. Situation hopeless. So they cry out to God for some help. Seems like a typical human response, don't you think? You ignore God until things start going wrong, and all of a sudden, God, where are you? Help me. Well, God hears their prayers, and he appoints a new judge over Israel, and surprising as it may seem, it's a woman named Deborah. Now, don't get me wrong, I have nothing against women, but the judges were usually military leaders, and in those days, women just were not military leaders. Well, Deborah was the wife of a man named Lipidoth. And to give you some idea of how important he was, the only thing the Bible tells us about him is his name. Now, Deborah and Mr. Deborah lived in the hill country of Ephraim between the towns of Ramah and Bethel. And every day, Deborah would go sit under a particular palm tree and hold court. Deborah is also called a prophetess in verse 4. In other words, sometimes God would speak through her. Now, Deborah must have had some authority in Israel, because in verse 6 says that she sent for Barak, and he came. Barak was the son of Abinoam, and he lived in Kadesh, which is a refuge city in Naphtali. Kadesh was near the Sea of Galilee, and it was about 60 miles north of where Deborah lived. Well, when Barak finally arrived at Deborah's palm tree, she informed him that he should take 10,000 men and go to Mount Tabor. And once he gets there, he's going to meet Sisera's chariots at the Kishon River, and God would deliver Sisera into his hands. Well, Barak was just a little bit skeptical. Yeah, sure, lady. Me and 10,000 foot soldiers are going to go up and defeat Sisera in his 900 iron chariots. So you think I'm crazy? Well, in spite of his doubts, Barak finally agreed to go, but on one condition. It's in verse 8. Barak said to her, "If you will go with me, I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go." So Deborah had to go along with him. Now, it isn't really clear why Barak had in mind here. My guess is he figured that Deborah wouldn't be willing to put herself at risk and go with him if God wasn't really in this thing. This may have been his way of testing the validity of what she said. It's also possible that he may have wanted her along just in case he needed to consult God about something during the campaign. But whatever the reason was, Deborah knew that God was on their side, so she did agree to go along. But before they leave, she tells Barak that he's not going to receive any of the credit for killing Sisera. Instead, Sisera was going to be killed by a woman. Now, maybe that was Barak's punishment for doubting God's message. But God doesn't really tell us why Sisera would be killed by a woman. It's possible that it was meant to humiliate Sisera's boss, Jabin. You see, having his strongest general killed by a woman would have been a real embarrassment for him. Well, Barak gathered the 10,000 men, and they set out for Mount Tabor. But you can't move that many men around without somebody noticing. So it isn't long before Sisera gets word from a Kenite named Heber that the Israelites are on the march. It would seem that Heber was a Jewish trader who was spying for the Canaanites. Well, when Sisera hears the news, he gathers his army along with his 900 iron chariots, and they set out to teach Barak a lesson he'll never forget. He moves southeast from Harosheth Hagoyim, and he sets up camp near the Kishon River. Now, look back at verse 14 and notice what Deborah says to Barak. And Deborah said to Barak, "Up, for this is the day in which the Lord has given Sisera into your hand." But pay attention to what she says next. Does not the Lord go out before you? Well, I wonder what she meant by that. That statement really isn't explained until you get into the poetic account of the battle in chapter 5. Look at verses 4 and 5 of chapter 5. Lord, when you went out from Seir, when you marched from the region of Edom, the earth trembled, and the heavens dropped. Yes, the clouds dropped water. The mountains quaked before the Lord, even Sinai before the Lord, the God of Israel. Then in verses 20 and 21 it says, from heaven the stars fought, from their courses they fought against Sisera. The torrents, Kishon, swept them away. The ancient torrent, the torrent Kishon, march on my soul with might. Apparently Sisera didn't know very much about that area because, believe it or not, he had camped right in the middle of the Kishon River. You see, the Kishon River wasn't really a river at all. It's what is known as a wadi. A wadi is dry most of the time, and whenever they get a heavy rain, it turns into a raging torrent. So Sisera could camp there because most of the time the Kishon River was really nothing more than a mudflat. But whenever they would get a heavy rain, it would turn into a raging torrent, and apparently that's what happened. You see, the night before the battle, the sky opened up and there was a tremendous cloudburst. This caused the normally dry Kishon River to become a raging flood. This flash flood had apparently destroyed a good part of Sisera's army as they slept. Well, and that wasn't bad enough. What was left got bogged down in the mud that was left behind by the flood. You see, iron chariots are very heavy, so they sank in the mud and became useless. This would explain why in verse 15 of chapter 4 it says that Sisera got down from his chariot and fled away on foot. Once again, God had intervened on behalf of his people, and he delivered them from their enemy in the face of insurmountable odds. Well, what happened to Sisera? Did he get away? No. He ran about 20 miles. Then he arrived at the tent of his pal Heber. If you remember, Heber was the turncoat who had warned him that Barak was coming. Well, Heber wasn't home when Sisera arrived, so he was greeted by Heber's wife Jael. And Jael tells Sisera, turn aside, my lord, turn aside to me, do not be afraid. So he turned aside to her into the tent. Well, Sisera had just finished running 20 miles, and I'm sure that the flood that had occurred the night before had prevented him from getting any sleep at all. So he was exhausted. Since he was feeling pretty safe right about then, he lies down to take a nap. And Jael even tucks him in. Verse 18 says, and she covered him with a rug. Isn't that sweet? And then in verse 19, just like a little boy, he says, please give me a little water to drink, for I am thirsty. But Jael doesn't give him water. Oh, no. In verse 19 again, so she opened a skin of milk and gave him a drink and covered him. Doesn't that give you the warm fuzzies all over? Well, it really gave Sisera a case of the warm fuzzies. So he says to Jael, stand at the opening of the tent, and if any man comes and asks you, is anyone here, say no. Then Sisera proceeds to go to sleep. Well, Jael does go outside, but not stand guard. Instead, she grabs a hammer and a long tent stake, and then this nice, sweet lady goes inside the tent, and she places the stake against Sisera's temple, and she proceeds to nail his head to the floor. Trust me, you definitely do not want to get this lady mad at you. So Barak and his troops are free to finish off what's left of Sisera's army, and the Israelites win the day. And verse 24 says they also win the war. And the hand of the people of Israel pressed harder and harder against Jabin, the king of Canaan, until they destroyed Jabin, king of Canaan. So with Sisera dead and his iron chariots destroyed, King Jabin's power was gone, and the Israelites eventually destroyed him too. You know, history is a long series of events where in times of crisis, someone has always stepped forward to become a leader. It's very difficult to imagine how the Allies could have won World War II without the leadership of men like Winston Churchill and Dwight Eisenhower, Chester Nimitz, and the others. I shudder to think of what would have happened if today's leaders were running the show in 1941 with the attack of Pearl Harbor. I mean, they probably would have formed a committee to find out why the Japanese were mad at us. One of the biggest problems facing the world today is a lack of strong leadership. Today's politicians are more interested in their own personal agendas than they are in the good of the country. In most of the elections that I participated in, I've always felt that I've been voting for the best of a bad lot. Well, in verse 2 of chapter 5, we read that the leaders took the lead in Israel, that the people offered themselves willingly to bless the Lord. In times of crisis, God has always sent the leaders that were needed to overcome the threat. But leadership is a two-way street. Simply being placed in a leadership position doesn't automatically make you a good leader. It only gives you the opportunity to be one. Leaders also need willing followers. Leaders are made leaders by the people who are willing to follow them. What good would the leadership be if no one was willing to follow you? That was true of Deborah's day, and it's just as true today. God provides us with leaders, but the leaders need followers who are willing to listen and follow their lead. And that's not always an easy thing for followers to do. It can be difficult to follow orders. Most humans would rather be the ones giving the orders. Unfortunately, most people aren't qualified to do that. Even so, being a good follower is just as important as being a good leader. After all, somebody has to stay on the ground and hold the ladder while someone else is climbing it. Christians must function within the church by filling the role that God has placed them in, being a leader or a follower. You might want to read 1 Corinthians chapter 12 when you get home today. It'll reinforce your thought on that. Now, it's perfectly natural for us to want to give orders instead of following them. But sometimes it's necessary for us to curtail that natural inclination and follow the orders instead. No one is qualified to give orders until he is capable of following them. Okay, so why is it so important for us to accept the roles as leadership or followers? Simple. God's people are still fighting battles today, and our cooperation with one another is critical for our success. Psalm 5 tells us this about God: "The boastful shall not stand before you. You hate all evildoers." God hates all forms of evil. He opposes its destructive nature. The battles that we fight today are not fought against iron chariots. They're fought against the spiritual and moral enemies of mankind. God is doing battle against the forces that want to destroy people. In other words, He wants to deliver them from the tyranny of sin. To do this, He very often requires the help of people. Now, don't misunderstand me. God could win the battle Himself without our help. Can you imagine how easy that would be for Him? All He'd have to do is open up the sky and say, "Here I am." And everybody on the earth will become an instant believer. Or He could enlist the help of a legion of angels. Every angel in heaven is chomping at the bit to get into the battle against sin. Peter wrote, "It was revealed to them," meaning the Old Testament prophets, "they were serving not themselves, but you in the things that have now been announced to you through those who preach the good news to you by the Holy Spirit sent from heaven, things which angels long to look." God chose not to do it that way. Instead, He enlists the help of people like you and me in the same way that He enlisted the help of Deborah and Barak. Nobody said that being a Christian would be easy. It requires effort on our part. Remember, the only thing that can sit on its butt and still be productive is a chicken. Now, anyone who has ever served on a nominating committee knows how hard it is to enlist the help that God requires for His people. And notice that I didn't say the help that He needs from His people. God can do without us. He's just chosen to do it with us. But the help that God requires doesn't always come. People are so wrapped up in the affairs of this life that they aren't concerned with the next one. Many times God calls people to help, but like Jonah, they refuse and they run off in another direction. But understand this, by refusing God's call, you are giving aid and comfort to the enemy. Whenever you say no to a job that God has called you to do, Satan smiles. If you want to be present when the roll is called up yonder, don't you think it would be nice if you made a little effort to be present when the roll is called down here? Well, Deborah and Barak ran into the same problem. Look at verses 16 and 17 of chapter 5. Why did you sit still among the sheepfolds to hear the whistling for the flocks? Among the clans of Reuben there was great searching of heart. Gilead stayed beyond the Jordan, and Dan, why did he stay with the ships? Asher sat still on the coast of the sea, staying by his landings. Every one of these men had an excuse. The men from the tribe of Reuben said that they had to tend the sheep. God even asked them why they felt that they needed to do that. The only thing that they could do would be to sit there and listen to the shepherds blow their whistles and they're herding the sheep. See, they weren't shepherds. They were more interested in taking care of the things of this life than they were in taking care of the things of God. The men from the tribe of Dan went sailing that day, and answering God's call interfered with their plans. It was just too inconvenient to change their plans to meet God's call. The men of Gilead, which included all the tribes that were east of the Jordan River, said that it was just too much trouble to cross the river. God was requiring more effort from them than they were willing to give. And the men from the tribe of Asher stopped at the beach and wouldn't go any farther. I mean, they were just lazy. Well, whenever God calls, what's your excuse? I mean, where do your priorities lie? Remember, whatever you've allowed into your life that you think is more important than God is the idol that you worship. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that there aren't times when you're asked to do something for the church and you just can't do it. For me, that's just about everything. But even though people might call on you to do something that you aren't able to do, God will never do that. If God ever calls you to do something for Him, He'll always make sure that you are able to do it. So, what we're talking about here is God's call to work. It's an attitude. Are you eager to work for God? Or do you grumble and try to think of reasons why you can't do it? If God is the one who's calling you to do something, trust me, you will be able to do it. All you need to supply is the willingness to do it, and God will supply the rest. But if there's a legitimate reason why you can't do something, God isn't the one who's calling you. If I were to be asked to help mow the grass of the church, you can look at me and know that God is not the one who is asking me to do that. So, we need to ask ourselves this question before we say no. Do I really have an excuse that requires me to say no? Or am I just looking for an excuse that allows me to say no? When God calls, we need to be like Deborah and just do it. Look at verse 23 of chapter 5. Curse Meroz, says the angel of the Lord. Curse its inhabitants thoroughly, because they did not come to the help of the Lord, to the help of the Lord against the mighty. When God drafts you into His army, you cannot remain neutral. Well, the men of Meroz had heard God's call, and they didn't make excuses. They didn't run away. In fact, they just stood by and didn't do anything. They remained neutral. Well, you can't remain neutral in God's war. You're either on God's side or you're not. You can't go through life being indifferent to the things of God. You need to decide whose side you're on. To make no decision is to decide against God. That's what the men at Meroz did, and they no longer exist. In fact, no one today even knows where Meroz was. If it wasn't for God's curse being recorded in the Bible, we wouldn't even know they existed. You can be the greatest Bible scholar in the world. You can have a character that is as pure as a new-driven snow. But if you're not willing to work for God's cause, God frowns. God is not happy when people commit themselves to doing nothing. James wrote, "But be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves." No matter how good you may be otherwise, doing nothing is just as bad as openly opposing God. No matter how good a soldier does during his training, no matter how perfect he is during a company inspections, if he refuses to fight when the time comes, he is useless. In God's war, there are no neutrals. There is also something else to bear in mind here. If you refuse to work, it places an even greater burden on the ones who will work. We usually have over 60 people in sanctuary every Sunday. But pay attention whenever this church has an event. It's always the same small group of people doing all the work. It's been said that in churches, 10% of the people do 90% of the work. God has gifted each individual with a talent to do a particular job for Him. If someone else has to step in because you refuse to do your job, it means that the job is being done by somebody who isn't quite as qualified as you were to do that job, and God's work suffers. The really comforting thing is this: even though there are many who refuse to come to God's call, there's always some who will show up. So it's a true statement when I say it's not always your ability that counts, it's your availability. You supply the availability, God supplies the ability. Look at verse 9 of chapter 5. My heart goes out to the commanders of Israel who offer themselves willingly among the people. Bless the Lord. People who willingly offer themselves to God's service will be used by God to accomplish great things. All of those who were willingly volunteered and trusted in God for the victory were there at the victory celebration. But those men who had made excuses because they didn't trust God for the ability to win the battle weren't there. We need to stop making excuses and start making ourselves available. God has a job for each of us to do. Sometimes we're called on to lead, sometimes we're called on to follow, and some jobs are not as glamorous as others. As we go through this life, we'll be called on to fill both roles. Sometimes you'll lead in one area, and at the same time you'll follow in another. Many of you are leaders in various committees and organizations within the church, but when you enter this room or you enter that sanctuary, your role changes from being a leader to a follower. Leaders need followers to get the job done, and followers need leaders to coordinate and give direction to their efforts. See, both roles are equally important. Another point that should be made from the passage is this: we are living in a very self-centered world today. People today are constantly being told that they are the most important thing in the universe, and meeting their needs should take priority over anything else in our lives. Because of this attitude, many people are refusing to work in the church because they couldn't care less about what happens to other people. As long as their needs are met, they're happy. Most people today search for a church in the same way they search for a supermarket. They make a list of the things they want, and then they set out to find a church that will supply those things to them. And I agree that a certain amount of that should happen, but most people neglect the most important thing. When people look at a church to attend, the first priority should be to find a church where they can use the gifts that God has given them to His glory. The first Sunday that Teresa and I attended this church, I told Steve Graves that we had just moved to Florida and we were looking for a church to attend. But I refused to join a church that can't find something for me to do. 2 weeks later, I was teaching the junior high kids. And I never dreamed how far Teresa would carry that. I mean, she made a career out of working for this church. And she hasn't stopped yet. But unfortunately, most people tend to look at church membership with a consumer attitude. I put my dollar in the offering plate, and this is what I want in return. But remember, the church is not in place to serve you. You are in place to serve God through service in the church. I know I've said that so many times you're probably sick of hearing it, but it's important to never forget that. Also, because of this attitude, people will always credit themselves with whatever victories they may accomplish. They forget all about God's involvement in the world. They forget where the strength to win those victories came from. See, bragging is something that we all do, and we tend to be very good at it. But we need to remember that we are all sinners and have been saved by the grace of God. We are the elect only by God's choosing. Nothing that we did earned that for us. Without God's help, we are nothing. Knowing that, we should help us reduce our need to promote ourselves. Whenever we start believing our own press releases, we're in trouble. Even Jesus, the God of the universe, revealed himself to man as a humble baby. He didn't do it in a palace. He wasn't wrapped in royal robes. He was wrapped in rags. He was lying in some hay in a feed trough and not in a feather bed. The greatest need in God's church today is for people who are committed to do battle in the name of the Lord. The church needs people who are willing to serve. And that requires people who are willing to make some sacrifices in order to serve. We need people who are willing to be inconvenienced in order to serve. We are to be soldiers in God's army, not spectators. On this ship, there are no passengers. Everybody's a part of the crew. Now, that willingness to serve will also accomplish something else. It provides a model for young people to follow. How do we expect the church to have a good leaders and followers to do God's work in the future if the young people today don't have role models to follow? If the only examples that they see are adults who spend most of their time trying to weasel out of working, how can we criticize them for doing the same thing? If all they see are shirkers and complainers, why should they be any different? Instead of looking forward to the day when they'll be able to take on more responsibility in the church, they're waiting until they get old enough that they don't have to do it anymore. And while I'm on a roll, how can we criticize our young people for not coming to Sunday school when their parents don't seem to see a need to attend themselves? Proverbs 22 verse 6 gives us this command: train up a child in the way he should go, and even when he's old he will not depart from it. Some parents will force their kids to come to Sunday school and study God's Word, but they won't come themselves. They think it's important for young people to read and study the Bible, but they don't think it's important for them to do the same thing. So what you're creating by doing that are kids who are just itching for the time to come when they are old enough to stay home and read the paper too. I have just finished my 62nd year as a Bible teacher. And in those 62 years, I have never seen a young person who has been attending Sunday school through senior high graduate from school and then join an adult Bible study. And that is sad. We need to set an example for young people to follow. And that applies to all young people, not just the ones who are related to us. We need to set an example of commitment to God's Word and to God's work. We must show young people that we have our priorities straight. And you do that by setting an example that you would be proud to see them follow. Serving God is not an option for the Christian. And studying God's Word is not an option for the Christian. It is not to be considered an extracurricular activity. It should be your whole life. Nothing less will do. Everything else in your life should be secondary to your service to the Lord. And like your career, that requires training. Well, we seem to have it backwards today. People will only agree to work for God if it does not inconvenience them at all. Well, I'm certainly glad that Jesus didn't think it was too inconvenient to die on that cross for us. I mean, Christianity is sort of like shaving. No matter what you're shaving and how well you do it today, you're going to have to do it all over again tomorrow. Jesus said, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. And James wrote, so also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. But someone will say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. And again, Jesus said, everyone who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man. And we must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. Someone once said that the hardest problem facing most pastors today is trying to determine when a church member is actually dead. Now, I know I'm preaching this lesson to the choir, but there are a lot of people who are listening to this lesson today at home and should hear it. But before you turn me off, I hope that you'll rededicate your life to doing God's work and stop inventing excuses for not doing it. Make doing God's work a priority in your life. Remember, everything else is temporary. So it's really not worth the effort. And don't do God's work for your sake alone or even for the sake of the church. Do it for the sake of the young people who look to you for an example of what Christian living is like. And when you succeed, remember where the success came from. Paul wrote, and God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that having all sufficiency in all things at all times, you may abound in every good work. If you supply the will, God supplies the way. There are many times when we can say, I can't, and it's really just an excuse and not a reality. Remember, God won't judge you by the work you did. The work you did was accomplished through His power anyway. You only did what He allowed you to do. God is going to judge you by what you refused to do when it was your power and your power to do it. Okay, one last point before we stop. How should a Christian approach his service to God? There's a very strange building in Ferrara, Italy that has exactly 365 windows. Nobody knows exactly why it was built that way, but legend has it that it was built that way in order to give the owner a different view of the world every day of his life. And before you ask, I don't know how they handled leap year. But, I mean, wouldn't that be nice, though? I mean, a different view of the world every day of your life. We all get tired of the same old, same old. We live in the same old street. We go to the same old job. We see the same old people. We listen to the same old Sunday school teacher. A new window every day could be a wonderful thing. But if we are Christians, that is exactly what we have. We need to approach every day as a new opportunity to work for God. We need to be open to God's call in any area of service. And we need to spend our time and energy working for God no matter what else we might be doing at the moment. And we need to stop wasting our energy trying to find ways to avoid it. This week, think about those areas where God may be calling you to lead. Also, think about the same areas that God may be calling you to follow somebody else's lead. See, both roles are important, not only for you as a Christian, and not only for the effort to defeat the enemy, it also sets an example for future Christians to follow. Questions?